Hi everyone, welcome back. So this is where we left off in the previous video in part 1. We used p5play to create some sprites with animations, one sprite for our player and a group of sprites for the enemies, for the zombie. And now we're at the point where we have to start thinking about how to create different states in our program, different game states. Okay? So we're going to start there in this video, and then we're going to talk about the gameplay. We're going to make this function a little bit more like a game. And then at the very end, we'll add a few refinements, like adding the sound to make it more exciting and things like this. So let's start by talking about game states. I have this little slideshow here, a few slates, just to kind of articulate what the problem is. So up until now, at least in this series, all the programs that we've written only had one state. And by that, it was we went from setup into draw, and then draw was our main animation loop, and that's where a program lived the whole time. And sometimes this draw loop was interrupted by events like mouse pressed or key pressed. But for the most part, our program only had one mode of being, one state, okay? And this kind of flow. Now, in the game we're trying to build this week, we need to expand on this idea a little bit. So here's for our game. If we were to break it down, we can break it down for this game into 3 parts, right? We have setup in the beginning, and I'm including preload in that state, and then that goes into some kind of intro screen where we want to be able to wait for the player to make a move, to click on something, maybe to just show some text and maybe a few images. And then from there, we want to be able to jump into another state. Let's call this the game, or run the game, right? So this is where we're actually going to be running around, dodging the zombies until one of the zombie finally gets us. And then we're going to move over into a game over state, right? So we might then show something else on the screen. Maybe we'll show where the player is, where all the zombies were, kind of maybe a freeze frame, right? Like we did in that example. And we're going to show some text telling the player, sorry, your game over. And then if you want to try again, click on the screen, something like this. And then from that game over state, maybe we'll allow the player to jump back into the game state. And then that may become, this becomes the flow chart for our game that we created. A different game might have a different flow chart. Maybe your game has levels or something like this. But as a starting point, this is a good place to start to talk about how to create these states. So in other words, what we're going to do is we're going to have to break draw down into 3 separate parts, right? So we can no longer have only draw. We need to split this up into 3 different parts, but we still have to work within the constraint of having draw, because that's how P5JS is structured. So there's a simple solution to that, which means if we want to break things down into draw, we're going to say draw has to do one of these 3 things at any given point in time, and only one of these, right? So we'll either do the intro portion or the game portion or the game over portion, but never more than one at a time. Okay? And there's a very simple solution to this. If we think of each of these game states that we have, if we think of them as separate functions, okay, so we're going to create an intro function, we're going to create a game function, and we're going to create a game over function. That's going to allow us to separate our code into these different areas of the program, these different blocks. And then we're going to use a variable to decide which one we want to run inside draw. And we can use an if statement on that variable to see if this variable is set to, let's say, intro, then we're going to call the intro function. And if the variable is set to runGame, then we're going to call the runGame function, right? So the solution to this is actually quite simple, and we're going to leverage functions not as reusable necessarily building blocks, right? These functions won't need any parameters. We're going to take advantage of the fact that functions allow us to split our code into different sections. Otherwise, our draw function might start to get really, really long, right, without using functions. So that's going to make the draw function a lot more manageable. So let's give an example. Let's just put that into practice. Okay, so let's say currently, right, the code we have, this would be the run game state, where we have our player following the mouse and we have zombies running around. Okay, so everything we're doing right now into draw, all this stuff, okay, this really should move into a separate function. So let's go below draw here. And again, I've mentioned this before, but I like to use these lines of comments to separate out my functions. Just gives me some visual cues where functions start and end. You don't have to do this. So let's make a function. We're going to call it runGame. Okay? And we're going to take all the code we have for running the game, we're going to put that into runGame. Okay? So now, of course, if I hit play, predictably, right? Oh, interesting point. So now we've put all the code into here, but remember p5play, right? It's still showing my game elements being drawn. Okay, they're no longer getting their updates, anything like this, but they're still being drawn, and that's because that's how p5play works, right? As soon as we make a sprite or a group, they get added to the list and they automatically get drawn. But this is something that we can actually turn off. So for our game, we're going to need to have a little bit more control over when the sprites get drawn, when they get animated, and so that we are able to decide, in this first intro screen, I don't want to have animation. I just want to be able to control what gets drawn in there. So in setup, we're going to go in setup in our program, and we're going to disable all of these default parameters of p5play. We're going to go on the all sprites array, and we're going to say autoDraw equals false. We're also going to say all sprites dot autoUpdate equals false. And finally, we'll say world. World is another global object. That's the one in the previous lessons we used to set gravity. Right? We're going to say world dot autoStep. So step is for the physics simulation when it steps through its kind of big math equation to do the physics. We're going to set all three of these, disable all the automatic stuff. Okay, so we're going to set that all to false, like so. And now, predictably, now this nothing happens. Okay, but now if we call runGame into draw, right, we're still not going to see anything because now we have to go into runGame and we've made this these auto things made to false now. So we're going to manually tell the sprites to draw themselves. We're going to manually tell the sprites to update, and we'll manually tell the world to step through its physics simulation. So let's jump into runGame. We'll go at the end of runGame, right? So after we've done everything, we're going to go at the very end and we're going to say all sprites dot update. We're going to say all sprites dot draw, and we're going to say world dot step. And now we're back to what happened before. Okay. The difference is we've now packaged this into its own function. So now we have the ability to say run this or don't, right? If we just comment that out, it's just not going to run. Or we could make this function conditional, right, on the value of a variable. So imagine we're going to go at the top here and we're going to create a variable called game state. And we'll say, let's start it off with runGame because we don't have another state right now. So we're going to create this global variable, and the idea in here is that this is going to act as kind of like a switcher. Depending on what we write down inside game state, in draw we're going to use if statements to say if game state is equal to runGame, right? Then we want to run the runGame function. Okay? Let's say we had another state, right? We're going to make a state called intro. Okay, so this intro state is going to be what we want to see when we first launch the game, when we're in the intro screen. Okay? So we're going to go into draw and say if game state equals intro, we're going to call intro. Okay? And let's go at the top here. This is where we want our program to begin, really. So let's put in intro as our initial game state. Okay. So now we can go into intro, and we can basically treat this as the draw function that we had before. Now this is the code we're going to program that's going to run at the intro. All right. So for example, we could say, let's write some text that's going to say zombie apocalypse in the center of the screen. Okay. All right. And we want to set a fill color. Let's set a green fill. Okay. So now we have an intro state, right? And we can keep programming this intro state a little bit. We're gonna make our intro screen here work for us a little bit better. Let's set some text attributes here. Let's set the text alignment to center. And let's see, text size. We definitely want to go bigger than where we are. Okay, that's a little bit better. Maybe we'll move it up a bit. Okay, and let's bring a font here in a second, but we're gonna we're going to do the rest of the text while we're at it. I'm going to set the fill to white. Also want to disable the stroke for the text. And let's draw some smaller text this time. Maybe like 20. Is 20 a good size? Maybe 24. And we're going to draw select a player to start. Centered in the middle of the screen. Okay. Maybe we'll change the font here. Text font. We use I really like this serif font. Okay. And then let's bring in a nicer font for this game title here, Zombie Apocalypse. So in the assets that I've included for this game, I have a file here called greenfuzz.ttf with a space in it. So we're going to load that as a font object, and then we'll be able to set that as our font before we're going to draw. So let's go into preload. We're going to say, first we'll make a global variable. Let's call this title font. Okay. And in preload, we'll say title font equals load font, and then we'll say assets greenfuzz.ttf. Please disregard the fact that it adds, as soon as it sees a color in a string, the editor sometimes gets confused, so we'll ignore that. This is going to load my font into this variable. Then once we've done this, we can go into intro, scroll down to intro, and we can set text font to title font. And that looks a little cooler. Awesome. Now, in addition to that, in the intro screen, we want to be able to draw our players, right, that we can choose from to start with. So currently we have the animation frames for our female player. Now, one thing we can do is we can say where's the intro here? Over there. The animation frame is basically an array, and it contains objects that behave like images. So if we wanted to draw the first frame of our animation sequence, we could say image female player Annie bracket 0. So that's the first frame of my sequence. That's a cool thing about p5play. It treats all these things like basic JavaScript objects that we're already familiar with. Let's make the one kind of on the left here, over there. So we'll say width divided by 2 minus 200, and then height divided by 2 plus 150. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, pretty good. So that's our female player over here. And now we need to let's load the animation for the male player over there. So let's go back to the top. We're going to add male player Annie. So let's make another variable for our male player animation. We want to add another animation over here. Just put it at the top. We'll say male player Annie. And we're going to reuse our handy image sequence function we made in the previous video. We'll say load animation, image sequence, assets, mPlayer dash, and this sequence has also 9 images. We don't need to look at you, sidebar. All right. And let's make a little bit of space. There we go. So now we have 3 animations and a title font being loaded in preload. Let's go back into intro. Oop, I scrolled past it. And now we're going to draw the male player first frame. And we're going to put that one on the right side. We'll change this to a plus. There we go. So now we have a little dude with the baseball cap, or we have her over here. And we could also say image mode center as well, just because it looks a bit off. There we go. That's a little bit better. Okay. So now we have an intro screen. At an intro screen, we could do whatever we wanted here. We could have animated things. Okay, I decided to just make it a simple, basic screen. And then we have a run game state, right? And depending on the value of game state, right? If I make game state equal to run game in draw here, we're going to see something different when we hit play, right? If we make game state equal to intro, we get another section of our code that can So now we can have any number potentially of these different states that our program can be in, and then it becomes a matter of being able to switch between them by changing the value of game state. Okay? So for example, let's program something that's going to take us from the intro screen into the run game state. Okay? So we're going to go, okay, let's go into the intro, and we're going to use the p5play mouse object. We could do this inside mouse pressed, okay? But I like to use p5play's mouse object for that because it allows us to do this directly inside these functions. And you'll see what I mean by this. So we'll say if mouse.presses, so this is going to behave like the mouse pressed event. It's only going to run once when we click the mouse. Okay? So we'll say if we have a mouse pressed while we're inside the intro state, so that's only going to work when we're in intro mode, we're going to take the game state and we're going to make it equal to run game. Okay? And now if we click in the window, we can jump from one state to the next. Okay? So transitioning between states is as simple as just changing the value of our game state variable. Now, in this case, what we actually want to happen is we want to be able to know if we clicked on a player or not, and then that's going to become the animation for our player sprite object moving forward. So what I'm going to do for this game, just to keep it simple, we're gonna kind of cheat a little bit. We'll say if we click on the left side of the screen, this is going to become our player, and if we click on the right side, we're going to take the male player object. And 99% of the time, your player, if you tell them to select a player to start, they're going to go with their mouse and actually click on one of the icons. So we'll just to keep it simple, we're just going to say if mouse.x is less than width over 2, okay, then we're going to say player.animation is going to be equal to the female player animation. And else we'll say player.animation equals to male player animation. Okay? And then in the beginning, we no longer have to add this this animation here. Cool. So now you can see if I click on the left, I get this as my player. If I click on the right, I get this as my player. Pretty cool. So it's still the same player object. We still only have one sprite object. All we're doing is swapping out the skin, basically. Okay, so let's delete that one. Actually, let's see what happens if I leave it. Just curious. Yeah, still works. Okay, so, but it becomes redundant, so we don't really need it because we're going to set it later on. So we'll just leave that up. Okay. Now, in addition to this, the other thing that happens is that depending on where we click, like the player has to kind of jump awkwardly, right? Because we're using move towards mouse here. So let's add a little bit of code to make this cleaner. We're going to say, in addition to set the player skin, we're going to also say when we click, depending on where we clicked in the window, we'll say player.x equals mouse.x, player.y equals mouse.y. So we're going to move the sprite at the location of the mouse, and that's going to make the transition a little bit more seamless. Because our sprite starts in the middle of the screen by default. So now if I click on this guy, it moves it there. And if I happen to click somewhere else, right, I get this player. It just moves to where my mouse was. So it's a little bit cleaner. All right. So this is how we create game states. We just make different functions for our different states. And in draw, we divide up draw by using if statements. And we say, based on the game state variable, we can switch now between two different game states. All right. So now that we have game states, let's turn our attention back to run game, because it's a little bit awkward now. We are creating 10 zombies in the beginning. What we really want to see here is we want to see some zombies coming in over time. Okay, so I'm going to comment this out. If I select my player, now I'm going to start in this empty world, and over time, we're going to add some zombies. Okay? So the way we're going to do this is we could do this based on the clock. We can do this based on actual time. But just for simplicity, instead of doing that with actual time based, we're just going to create a counter variable. Let's call this variable at the top here. We're going to call it new zombie counter. Okay. All right. So we're going to start this off at 0. And then in our run game function over here, we are going to say, let's put this closer to when we're actually doing the zombie behavior. Let's put this over here. We're going to say add zombies every 60 frame. Okay, so that's basically 1 second. So every second, we're going to add another zombie to the game. Okay, so we'll say new zombie counter plus plus. So we're going to increase the counter by 1. And we'll say if new zombie counter exceeds 60, so if we get past 60, we're going to add a new zombie. We'll say first we'll reset the counter back to 0. And then we can say new zombies.sprite. So this is going to make a new object from the zombies group. And if we wanted to, we could put this into a variable in case we need to do something to that object as we create it. We'll have a variable that contains the new object we just made. We'll revisit that a little bit in this later on in this video as we make some little refinements here. But let's see what that looks like. So now every second, right, there's going to be a new zombie that gets created. The counter is always getting increased by 1 every frame. When we reach the 60 threshold, we reset it back down to 0, and we say new zombie.sprite. And because zombies is a p5play group, right, new zombies, just as a little reminder, new zombies get all of these attributes automatically, right? They get a random position, a random velocity, right? And they get the animation, same as all the other ones. Yeah. So now we have zombies coming in over time. Now, of course, we don't have code right now that's going to detect when a zombie actually catches us because we're just moving around here. And, you know, I can push them around, but this is not really fun. It's not super realistic. So instead, just to kind of complete the game here, we are going to say, let's go into our runGame state. And we're going to look for the condition when, as we go through, so we're going to go in our for loop that we're going through the array of zombies. So what we're going to want to do is say, as we go through this array, let's check if any of the zombies, right, if any of the zombies overlaps with the player. Or in other words, if their collision box overlaps with the player's collision box. And if that happens, then we know a zombie has gotten us. Okay? So this is our random direction change. Forgot to put a comment there before. And then check for overlap with player. We'll say if z.overlaps player. So z is our zombie frame that we get in the for loop, right? We get, sorry, our zombie sprite that we get through the for loop. If the zombie overlaps with the player sprite, then game over, right? So what we could do here is we could say game state equals game over, right? We could change the game state to game over. Then let's say I pick my character. I'm going to intentionally run into a zombie here. And then boom, right? We get into game over state. Okay? Now we don't actually have a game over function. So what happens is it just doesn't do anything anymore. And we just see the last image that we saw when we called runGame. So next step is we're going to actually write the game over stage. So let's go down, make a new function somewhere we have space. We're going to call this function game over. Okay. And we are going to go into draw. So I should have done that while we were there before. We're going to put a little if statement. It's going to say if game state equals game over. We're going to call this game over function. And in the game over function, let's go and put a few things here. So we'll say, let's clear the background to black. We're going to borrow some things from our intro screen here. We're going to borrow the text just to save on time. We're going to borrow the text from the intro screen. We're going to put that here into game over. Maybe we'll change the color to red for this text. And we'll, instead of writing zombie apocalypse, we'll say game over. And then we're going to write a prompt. We'll say, click to try again. And then this is going to happen. So I'm going to select a player. I'm going to get caught by a zombie, and then we get into the game over screen. And then if I click to try again, nothing happens because we haven't programmed that yet. Let's go back to our game over screen. Now, it would be nice to still be able to see where the player was and where the zombies were when we got hit, when we got bitten. So we're going to say all sprites dot draw. So remember, these are now manually triggered. So if we say all sprites dot draw, this is going to cause p5play to draw all of its sprites. So now we can get this freeze frame effect. Because we're only doing draw, well, we're not saying all sprites dot update, right? So the update includes the animation. So if we're to do both, right, we would still get the animation. Here we have the choice, right? We could say only draw, don't update, and we're also not processing physics anymore at this point because everything is frozen anyways. So now that these functions are manual, we can decide when they run. Okay? And then we could add a little if statement here that's going to say if mouse presses. So the mouse object, again, is useful because we can now create events inside each of our separate game sections instead of having to go through the one mouse pressed event and then have to do more if statements in there. So that's handy. We could say if we press the mouse, let's restart the game. Okay, we're going to say game state. We're going to jump back into runGame. Now, this is a little bit unfair because if we do this, here's what's going to happen. If I get hit and if I click to try again, I'm just moving to where the mouse is, but all the same zombies are still there. Okay, so we want to start from scratch. So we're going to say zombies. So zombies is our group. We want to remove all. So if you have a group, you can say remove all, and this is going to take all those objects out of the game and allow you to start again from scratch. So now if I hit a zombie and if I click somewhere, I start again from scratch. Okay? Now, if I'm moving my cursor here, but we can no longer see it because the cursor visible is disabled. Okay? So if I click further away, my character does this teleport thing again. So let's go and say player.x equals mouse.x, player.y equals mouse.y. And we could even do something where at the game over screen, it's kind of annoying not to be able to see our mouse cursor anymore. So we're going to turn it back on. We'll say mouse.cursor, mouse.visible equals true. So now we get here, we can click there, the cursor disappears. If we become game over, we get our cursor back and we can click to try again, right? So we can play with those. And this is a lot of what kind of building the game becomes, is just figuring out all that glue code, all of that logic. Okay. All right. So let's make a couple of improvements here to the game before we wrap up. So one thing that I think we're missing from this game is we're missing a score. And the score is important, I think, because that allows us to gauge how well we're doing. It will motivate your players to try to beat their score. So the longer we stay alive, the more zombies we create, that could simply become our score. Okay? So all that could simply be is we're going to add a little bit of text in runGame. So we're going to go to runGame. We can do this, let's say we'll do at the beginning here. We'll set no stroke, white fill. Let's go a text size of, I don't know, 20. We'll set the text font just in case. Back to Arial. We'll set the text alignment to left. And then we'll draw score. And then to this, we could simply say for the score, we'll say, look at our zombies group. Check its length. How many zombies do we have? And that can just be the score. And we'll put that at the top left here. So now when we go into the game, we have this display. And score is just the number of zombies we have. Right? The score could also be a separate variable, right, that we just increase over time. So this doesn't have to be complicated. It would also be nice if we could see the score when we're game over, if we could still see it. Right? So we're going to have to draw this score twice. We're going to have to draw it during runGame and also during game over. So whenever we have to do something twice, always a good idea to avoid repeating ourselves. We're gonna make up a function called draw score. Okay? So let's go down at the bottom, make a new function called draw score, and I'm going to paste the code I just cut from draw. Let's be consistent here and put our comments. So now every time we want to see the score in the top left, we can call draw score, which means we can also now do this at the beginning of the game over, not before background though. We can do this over here. At the beginning of game over, we can draw the score again. So always a good idea to watch for those places in your code, in your game, where if you're duplicating, if you're doing the same thing twice, take a minute, package it as a function so that you don't have to repeat yourself. Let's say we don't like the look of this text here, we want to tweak it. Now there's only one place where we have to do that as opposed to two places. All right. And then finally, just to put like the little finishing touch on this game example for this week, we are going to add some music because it just makes everything more fun once there's music playing, just for a dramatic effect. So in the assets that we uploaded, we also have this tune.mp3. So let's go and load up a song. So we'll say, let's create a variable here, and we'll make another global variable for our sound object. Let's call it music. We're going to go into preload. We're going to say music equals load sound assets tune.mp3. Okay. And then now we have this sound object that we can play. So for this game, I decided I'm not going to get the music to play right away. For dramatic effect, I'm going to wait until the player gets selected and the song starts with this kind of sort of boom, and it just creates a cool effect, I think. So we're going to go into intro. And we'll say this is here. When we set the player skin, when we jump into runGame, we're also going to say music.play. Okay? And I want to make sure this works. So I'm going to put on my headphones. And let's try it out. Cool. So this is just to make the game a little bit more fun to play. Now when we become game over, we're also going to say when we click to try again, we're gonna restart the music back at the beginning. Okay. So the way that we could do this is we're gonna go into game over. When we say mouse press, try again, we'll say music.stop. If you hit stop, the track goes back to the beginning, and then we'll say music.play again. Let's try it. Now I'm noticing here the text is behind my player, so that's kind of annoying. We're going to move this. We're going to move all sprites.draw. We're going to move it before all of this. Move it over here. We'll still leave draw score. Actually, let's put draw score after here. We'll put all sprites.draw before. And we're also going to do it with the draw score in runGame. Just little tweaks here. We're going to move that draw score after we draw the sprites. Okay. And let's try this. I'm going to try to die in the middle here just to see what happens. Oh, damn it. Okay, now the text is on top. And if I click to try again, the song restarts. Okay. All right. So those were not exactly 100% necessary, but little tweaks like this. So to recap, right? What we've done this week is now that we know about the basic elements of p5play, which really are primarily, right? We have sprites, we have groups, and then we have animations that we can add attached to our sprites. And what p5play gives us is the physics and the physics simulation and the collisions. And on top of that, our job just becomes, let's manipulate these game objects to create these sprite objects to create a game experience. And we've done this in that example by saying, okay, well, we're going to have these basic mechanics. We're going to have the player follow the mouse. We'll have the zombies move on their own. And if the zombies catch the player, we use this as a way to toggle between game states, between runGame and game over. All right, so I think we're going to leave it at that for this week's tutorial. Please feel free to try it out for yourself using the assets provided, or try to do a version of that with your own assets if you'd like. Yeah, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks, everyone. As I was wrapping up the video, I actually realized I forgot to talk about something. And I'm just going to take an extra minute or two to talk about one more idea that I wanted to cover this week. So you'll notice that if you play the game for a little while, it's going to become apparent after some time that there are instances where, because we create those zombies randomly, there's going to be these very unfair moments that happen where a zombie is going to spawn directly on top of where your player is standing. And it can happen sometimes. It doesn't. I'm not going to wait for it to occur, but you can imagine that it's quite frustrating. You'll probably experience that if you play the game a little bit. So we're going to add a little bit of logic in our code to just prevent that from happening. So we're going to be a little bit more careful here about how we create these new zombies. So here's what I mean by this. So right now we say in every time this new zombie counter exceeds 60, we just go ahead and we make a new zombie object. And then it could, by chance, that zombie could happen to be right where our player is at the moment. So we're going to use a little algorithm to figure out, is the zombie going to kill the player? And if it will, then we're going to get rid of that zombie and we'll make a new one. Okay? So the idea is that we're going to check, okay? We're going to say if the distance between the location of the zombie, the new guy, okay, and the player. So we'll measure the distance between these two objects, and we'll say, let's come up with a safe distance here. Let's say if the distance is like less than 100, that means we're actually kind of close. Then odds are maybe in the next frame, the zombie will eat us right away. Okay, let's watch our parentheses here. It's actually 2 parentheses. So if we find that this happens, I'm going to say, okay, this new zombie we just made, we don't want him. We'll say new guy.remove. So sprites that are parts of groups or just generally parts of p5play, they all have a remove function. If you call it, these sprites will get removed. And then we'll say new guy equals new zombies.sprite. So we'll just go ahead and make a new one. Okay. Now, if you're paying attention, you may be asking yourselves, wait a minute, are my curly brackets wrong here? Where's the red squiggly line? Oh, sorry, I have an extra parenthesis. That was fine before. Okay, so oh, I deleted this by accident. Okay, let's go back to distance. Okay, code runs again. Now you may ask the question, what about if the next one we make also happens to kill the player? That could happen, right? Well, one way that we can work around this is we can say, let's turn this into a loop. Okay, so instead of using an if statement here, we could use a while loop. Okay? And we're going to say, keep trying to find a new spot on the screen that's not going to kill the player right away. Okay? So if we're really, really unlucky, in other words, if the zombie we make over here happens to be too close to the player, and then the next zombie that we make again also happens to be too close to the player, the while loop structure here is going to allow us to try again until we're successful. Okay? So this is a great example of a while loop. When we first introduced the while loop, we kind of talked about it as this is sort of the general loop format, but for the most part, we use for loops 99% of the time. But then occasionally there are these instances where the while loop can be handy. In this case, it's useful because I don't really know how many iterations I might need in order to solve this problem. I might need 0 iterations, right? If this distance function test here returns true, then we're good. This new guy here, we can keep him. But if it returns false, we want to go in here, remove it, make a new one, and then check again, okay, until we get it right. So this while loop in this scenario becomes handy. And there's very little risk of an infinite loop because there's tons of room on the screen for the zombie to go, as long as it's not 100 pixels, more than 100 pixels away from our player. It's going to be a safe space for the zombie to spawn, and the while loop allows us to do this. So now we should never run into the scenario where we're going to have a zombie spawning directly on top of our player's head, which is a little bit unfair. It's bad enough that it's a zombie apocalypse. Let's not make it worse. Okay, so This time, we're going to wrap up the video for real. So hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial, and I will see you in the next one.